everyone. Welcome to Inside the Chrysalis. Our goal for this podcast is to introduce and discuss psychological concepts in the context of the real world. And today's podcast is one of our roundtables where we gather a group of experts to weigh in on one particular concept and discuss how it impacts us personally. And so today actually happens to be our very first episode. So welcome. We're going to address something that is a common experience to each of us, and I think probably to many of our listeners as well. And this is the concept of imposter syndrome. And I really wanted to discuss this today because when I first thought I was going to start a podcast like this, where I was talking to people about psychology, I was actually really haunted by imposter syndrome, by this feeling of who am I and who am I to teach these things, even though literally that is my job every day, is to teach these things. So today we are just going to exercise that ghost. I'm Dr. Michelle Quist. I'm a teaching professor at Penn State, and I have three colleagues on the call. So let's start with Dr. Chelsea Young. You want to say hi, Chelsea?
Hi, everybody. I'm an assistant professor in social psychology at Rowan University.
Awesome. Welcome, Chelsea. And then we have Dr. Jen Bryan.
Hi, everybody. I teach mental health education at the VA, and I'm an assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine.
Hi, Jen. And then finally, we have Dr. Angie Leroy.
Hi, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Rice University, and I study the mind-body connection.
Perfect. So welcome, you three. So let's go ahead and just jump straight in. And Angie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what imposter syndrome is?
Sure. So this term imposter syndrome is a fancy term for a psychological phenomenon or something that just kind of happens naturally when people are unable to internalize their accomplishments. So this can be despite external evidence, so evidence of their competence from the outside world. These people with imposter syndrome, quote unquote, might remain convinced that they're frauds and do not deserve the success that they have achieved. Proof of success is dismissed as luck, timing, or as a result of deceiving others into thinking they are more intelligent and competent than they believe themselves to be. And when Michelle said we were going to be talking about this topic today, I did some digging into imposter syndrome and I thought, oh, well, I've certainly felt that before, but I wonder if there's something special about people who feel this way, or if this is kind of a phenomenon we all experience. And it seems as though we can all experience imposter syndrome to some extent, but people who tend to be high achieving or kind of that stereotypical overachiever of sorts might be more likely to have this syndrome. And just, when we say this word syndrome, we're talking about kind of like this sort of pop psych definition of a syndrome. We're not actually talking about diagnosing someone with something like this. It's kind of a fun term to bring light to the sort of silliness of what this is. So for high achieving individuals in particular, they might be marked by this inability to internalize or believe that they deserve and have worked for their accomplishments, and have this persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud, or, oh, someone's got to figure out that I really shouldn't be called an expert in this area, or I really shouldn't have been successful in that area. And so, so they tend to be higher achievers. And then also there tends to be this consistent fear of failure, which can be really crippling. And they also tend to be perfectionists. So people who tend to fall into this sort of imposter syndrome category tend to be higher overachievers, likely to be more perfectionists or have perfectionist tendencies. Those types of people are more likely to suffer from imposter syndrome. And the last one I thought was interesting is that imposter syndrome affects women more predominantly than men, which for all of our women listeners right now, that may not come as a surprise to you, but it's something we can discuss today. Michelle?
Interesting. Okay, so what I'm hearing is it's tied to accomplishments and achievement, right? So we accomplish something or we achieve something, and then we feel like we maybe don't deserve to represent that accomplishment or achievement, and so we feel like a fraud. And then we try to make up for that feeling like a fraud through perfectionism or trying too hard, and then we're also marked by persistent fear.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a backpedaling, right? So maybe you achieve something or on paper, like a certain degree. You go and you get your college education and you feel all proud and you walk across the stage, and then you go out into the real world and you get your first job with that degree and you say, oh, wait, should I really be here? Should they be asking me these questions that on my diploma it says I should know? And it's like kind of you start to doubt yourself. So yeah,
Right.
It's like this theme of self-doubt, and I think of it as like backpedaling, where even if we've made the achievement substantially and we have proof of the achievement, like let's say a diploma, we still
Sure.
talk ourselves out of it and kind of move backwards mentally about it.
Right, because you received that diploma and you're still the same person you were yesterday when you didn't have the diploma. And so you don't feel the change even though you've crossed a boundary. So yeah, it makes sense. So let me ask everybody on the call. So have any of you felt imposter syndrome in your experience, your personal moments of imposter syndrome?
Oh, for sure. So when we talked about this being the topic, I was thinking, really, when did this start for me? And I think because I came from a really small Midwestern town where people didn't get advanced degrees. I was a first generation college student. Neither of my parents went to college. So when I was applying for college and moving into college and going to college, I very much felt like an outsider. And maybe that was the start of imposter syndrome of I don't belong here. There's something different about me. So trying to navigate this world that I really didn't have any sort of background or insight into, and feeling like I had to prove myself a little extra to fit in or to be worthy of such a position as a college student.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if it's really imposter syndrome or kind of like a class-based issue. So like Angie was talking about, of maybe a women's issue or maybe a class issue, or both, having to do with hierarchies and people in power. I don't know.
Well, the thing it brings to mind for me, honestly, is this when Angie is talking about it being related to achievement and it's high achieving, that sense of achievement is going to be relative, right? So if you're from this area where not a lot of people go into higher education and then you go into higher education, that is going to maybe feel like a bigger achievement or accomplishment gap than if it was from an area where everybody went off to higher education.
Yeah, for sure.
What about you, Jen? Do you have any imposter syndrome stories?
Yeah, I was thinking that I'm also a first generation college student, and my mom told me my whole life that I was going to college and that's who I was. So when I went to college, I felt like I pretty much fit in there. But then when I got to grad school for probably about the first 6 months, I was very certain that the school was going to tell me that they accidentally accepted me and that I can pack my bags now because I just didn't belong. So it took a while because I thought I was the only one that felt like that because nobody talks about this. But there were just some really clear differences when I first got to grad school. I have a different personality than most academics. I am very bubbly, and people would refer to me as the cheerleader. And cheerleaders and scientists don't really go together. So I felt like clearly I didn't belong. It's definitely a fluke that I got here.
That's interesting because when I met you, and I thought the cheerleader aspect of you was like a welcome relief,
Yes.
like to someone that was just bubbly and friendly and outgoing, and I felt instant friendship with. That was it never even occurred to me to think that it didn't belong. I was just glad to see it.
Yeah, and that's the thing is sometimes I think when we get caught up in these moments of feeling like an imposter, like we're not good enough to be there, surely someone's going to find out that I shouldn't have been brought into this program. They're going to send me home. But it's funny because like what Jen's talking about sounds to me like some of Jen's strengths. Like I wouldn't want Jen to talk like just any other academic, because then it kind of ostracizes or leaves out all kinds of other people that don't communicate that way. And that's actually, in my opinion, like a weakness that sometimes we have in academia. And so there are certain things that it's all about our perception is kind of what I'm trying to emphasize here, is if Jen was perceiving that as a weakness or something that people weren't going to be accepting of, or weren't going to value about her, that wasn't enough, then that was going to be a harmful thought process to have. Whereas from the outside looking in, we love that about Jen, and we're like, yeah, no, that's your strength. What are you talking about?
See, that's my strength as a friend, and you're coming to grad school and you're meeting new people, and there's this really friendly person, but that's a friend, that's not a scientist. So that's something that I've struggled with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it is all about perspectives. So I have something kind of funny. I'm actually feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome now about us talking about imposter syndrome, because my example of imposter syndrome feels so very basic. Basically, it was 20 years ago. I've got my very first apartment that's all mine, right? And I walk in, and the apartment was actually super nice. I don't know how I got an apartment that nice, but it was really, really nice. And I walked in, and had this pretty kitchen. It was brand new and everything. And I I just like Jen was saying, I felt like someone was going to come take my keys away. Like, honestly, somebody was going to walk in and just be like, we gave this to you by mistake. You don't deserve this place. I don't know. That doesn't feel particularly high achieving to me to get my own, apartment or anything. But like that, I definitely had this feeling of being a fraud. Like, these people are trusting me to be an adult, and I am so not an adult yet. Tell me that counts, Angie.
Totally counts. No, it totally counts. I was in the moment, like putting myself in your perspective and feeling your pain. And that's interesting too, because you're talking about something that was 20 years ago and it still obviously hits home for you. Like you can remember the way that felt.
Absolutely. I mean, it's funny now, obviously, but it was very salient, and I can still, experience that emotion like it just happened yesterday. Like it was so very strong that I just felt like I didn't belong there. And every time people would come visit, they would talk about how nice the apartment was and how it was so much better than their first apartments and all of this stuff, and it would make me feel even worse.
Yeah.
Like it was like, I definitely don't belong here. Someone definitely made a mistake, because all of these people don't seem to think that I deserve this either. And of course, that's not what they were saying. They absolutely were not saying I don't deserve this apartment, but that is how I was interpreting, what they were saying.
And actually going along that lines, so I just turned 32 and I'm an assistant professor. I work with college students all the time, and I have been mistaken for a student so many times. And it's at professional conferences, it's on campus, it's around. I'm dressed professionally. I don't know what I could do differently, but people keep telling me, oh, are you a student? What year grad student are you? And so that's kind of one of those moments where I question myself because other people seem to be questioning me. And so I'm thinking, oh, I must not belong here. I must not look like I belong here. I must not look like a professor. I must look like a student. How can I differentiate myself from students? And so having other people tell you or make you feel as though you don't fit this role or you don't deserve this position or this apartment or something like that, I wonder how much that plays into imposter syndrome.
That's a good question. I think we might get into that when we start talking about where imposter syndrome comes from. I'm curious though, Angie, when you were going through your definitions of imposter syndrome, was there a moment or something that stood out to you that was a personal moment of imposter syndrome?
Yes, and it came from a strange place. So, for listeners' context, I am also an academic, just like these ladies who have shared their stories. And you'd think that I would go right there in my mind, but I actually thought of this other area of my life that's really important to me, and that's my work with horses. I have this deep passion for horses, and I've had a deep passion for horses my whole life from the time when I was a little girl. And we'll get into this more in terms of, where imposter syndrome might come from, but I do think that that plays a role here in terms of I had some negative experiences in losing my horse when I was a young girl. And so I didn't do anything with horses for many, many years. So I didn't work on my horsemanship. I didn't ride. And when I moved to Texas for grad school, I started riding there, and I built up my kind of repertoire, my toolkit, so to speak, about how to work with horses, how to communicate with horses. And I practice this like more natural horsemanship and those techniques that are kind of revered by some in the horse world and then kind of looked down upon by others. So just like any other kind of social group, you have a variety of people and opinions about how you should be doing things, let's say. And I never felt such severe imposter syndrome until I got so I board my horse, which means I have to keep it at a facility where other people can take care of it during the day, because unfortunately my horse doesn't live on the same property that I do. And that means that there's lots of other people who own horses who I interact with out there, because we all kind of share the same barn space and riding arena and property in that way. And so when I was kind of a newbie at the barn, there wasn't too many people there at the time. And I started getting compliments about some of the work I was doing with my horse and our horsemanship, like our relationship and my horsemanship skills. And I thought, what? I surely, why are they complimenting me? Like, because inside this has been such a hard process for me inside. And yes, I'm a good study, and I read all of the books and I watch all of the videos and I practice, but inside this is an eternal struggle. And so even though outwardly people who were watching me be successful with my horse and meet these milestones with him, I was like, I just didn't believe it. I didn't believe anything that they were saying. And they were even asking me for advice sometimes, or saying like, oh, hey, can you hold my horse while I, put, some kind of medication in his eye, which is like a really like kind of dangerous, difficult thing to handle. And I found that I just was left feeling completely scared and like, no, I'm not good enough to be among these people. Surely I'm going to get kicked out of the horse world, or someone's going to take my horse away any day now. And sometimes it's this really paralyzing feeling, particularly because I did have an experience when I was a young child where I lost my horse suddenly and it felt like my horse was taken away. And so I think something important that we have to talk about next is where these experiences come from, in addition to how these imposter syndrome tapes are playing in real time in our minds and how we're interacting with our environment and perceiving things differently. It also has to do with where those imposter tapes came from and what kind of memories are sort of triggering those tapes to go on.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that was sort of like someone can relate to that, even though I gave you this super specific example about horses. But
even the structure inside your example of you struggling with this thing and learning this thing and then getting to the point where you know it, nobody else can see that. So it's like you said it in the definition portion when you were talking about it being this internal struggle. Nobody sees that part. And it's possible, had they seen that part, that they would be able to recognize that and it would feel more authentic, but they just see the outside and they just react to that. And so then, yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's basically, I'm thinking about this internal locus of perception and how we are filtering what we hear from other people through stuff that's inside of us that they don't realize is there. I'm going to take a quick break. So we're going to take just a couple minutes. And then when we come back, what I want to talk about is where we feel like imposter syndrome stems from. And then we'll start talking about what we can do about it. But first, we're going to talk about where it stems from right after this break. Okay, so welcome back. We've been talking about imposter syndrome. We went through some of our personal moments of imposter syndrome, and we sort of introduced the issue of where we feel like imposter syndrome stems from. So someone speak to that. Like, where do you think imposter syndrome comes from?
well, I started kind of hitting on it in my naturally because it was coming up in my mind when I was telling my story. But I think based on our past experiences, it can certainly sort of lay the foundation or make it more likely that we experience this syndrome of sorts. So if we've felt like, we haven't been up to snuff in the past, or that we've been given something and then it was taken away, some kind of success or marker of our success, or if, we've developed expectations that things need to look a certain way in order for it to be acceptable based on past experience. So to me, I always, when I think about the timeline of our life and how things influence us right now, you can always go back in time in your life and think about, usually link something to how you're feeling right now to something that happened before. So that's kind of where I always start when I'm thinking through these types of things.
Absolutely. If I pull out that piece of you feeling before, like you weren't up to snuff before, like you failed before, and so you feel like that failure is coming again, then that could be where this imposter syndrome is coming from.
I think it has to do with building on what Angie said, the expectations. So I was thinking that like I also identify as a traveler, and I have like the best stories that I can go back and forth with other travelers about the crazy things that I've done while traveling. And I feel like, if there's such a thing, an expert traveler, but there's no expectation of what a traveler is supposed to look like. So I belong in that group. Nobody's going to call me out for not belonging because there's not a clear expectation, and this is what you have to do to belong in the club, kind of thing.
I see. So you're saying that you don't feel any imposter syndrome around traveling, even though that's something that you have a high level of achievement in, because there's no like expectation or representation of what that traveling expert is meant to look like. So you don't have anything to compare yourself to, so you can't feel like a fraud.
Yes, and then the people that I do like compare myself to. We just like mutually respect, like, oh, that was a cool experience, versus like, this is what the ideal traveler looks like. So maybe it's the ideal expectations.
It's like an evaluative component. It's not just here's my experience, but there's a right way to do a thing.
Like competition rather than cooperation.
Yeah. So that makes me wonder, Chelsea, when you're talking about, well, in Gen 2, you were both talking about being first generation college students and then feeling imposter syndrome when you went off to college. It makes me wonder if there's this expectation we build that breeds from unfamiliarity. So we basically have just kind of like the outlines of our expectation that is fed by unrealistic schemas, I guess, that are set up. And so we have this expectation. And if we really were to tear it down, or if we were to break it down, it actually wouldn't really make sense because we haven't put any meat on it. But because it's there, that's what we feel like we should live up to. Did that make any sense?
Yeah, I think also looking at models around us, like you're saying, so taking our expectations from exemplars that we have and saying, okay, well, I need to be my graduate school mentor when I get my first job, and realizing that that's not a reasonable expectation. You can't pretend that you have 20 years experience in your first job ever, and that's okay. So kind of learning how to temper your expectations based on where you're at right now, rather than just shooting for this ideal that you want to be, but kind of recognizing that there are many steps in between and that those steps are still progress.
Yes, perfect. And I think that idea of exemplar is where I was going, but I was saying that our exemplar, if we have unfamiliarity with the concept, then our exemplar is not even realistic. Like if you don't know anybody who's gone off to college and your only exposure to people who have gone off to college is like the teen TV shows you watch, that does not give you a realistic view of what college looks like, you know? And then I think what you're saying is an extension of that then once you go on to embody this new achievement, even if you've had exposure or experience with it, it still can set this unrealistic expectation because you think not only do I have to be this person, but I have to be the best version of this person. And that's just not realistic.
So it's kind of like just the eternal striving component that might be related to imposter syndrome, where if you're always striving for the next level of achievement, you might be feeling like you didn't deserve your past level of achievement.
Yeah.
Or your current level.
Right. The nothing is ever good enough kind of. So I wonder how much that is a part of it.
And that makes sense then, going back to some of the definitions I was reading or some of the research that was finding that high achieving individuals or people who tend to be high achievers or quote unquote overachievers, always striving, are, marked by this inability to really internalize their accomplishments.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you guys were talking about exemplars, about the factor that I was pointing out earlier about how imposter syndrome affects women more predominantly than men. And I'm not sure the context in which they've actually done research on that, but I wonder if it has more to do with the expectations and roles that women find themselves in, and whether those roles conflict with the expectation or those lack of exemplar. So I'm thinking, like, when you guys were talking, I was thinking about like women in the workforce or women higher up, like a higher level jobs, like CEOs, for example. And perhaps like female CEOs might get this imposter syndrome more often than men do because they have there's a different set of expectations for women in the workforce. There's not very many good exemplars, to be quite frank, but there's, all these bad women in the workforce. But I mean, we haven't had kind of a history of these positive, successful exemplars to sort of compare ourselves to. And so I think it depends on all kinds of different things. But I also wonder if that's the case, not just for women, but anybody who finds themselves to be in a role, hopefully they're in a role where they're trying to achieve something, but whether they're high achieving or not, just in a role where they don't really have a good idea about, or realistic idea about, what that looks like. And so that kind of goes back to what you guys were saying.
And I have an example for that too, actually, that might be more relatable. So the idea of adulting, which I don't love that term, but that's kind of what it sounds like you're describing to me, of having these, exemplars of what an adult is, and this kind of period of becoming an adult now that is far extended from what it used to be, and not really having a clear what is it to be an adult starter kit, for instance. So
Right.
how do you know that you're an adult, or what are adults capable of? Is it when you do your taxes for the first time, or what is the demarcation? How do you become an adult? Who teaches you these skills?
And I mean, don't we
Right.
all get imposter syndrome when we're filing our taxes? Like, that's
Oh
the
my
worst part.
gosh, it is
Someone
the
is gonna catch
worst.
me because I'm screwing something up, but I don't even know it.
Why do I have to pay money? I don't get it.
I don't actually feel imposter syndrome when I'm doing my taxes anymore, but I've got like 10 years on you guys, so I guess that maybe that's why. But but
Leveled up on her
when
tax achievement.
yay,
That's an
go me.
accomplishment.
Mhm.
Look at us validating each other and preventing imposter syndrome.
Well, yeah, I had my own business for several years, and so that is some complicated taxes. So now taxes are just a breeze. But anyway, I want to go back, Angie, when you were talking about the expectations of women and women experiencing imposter syndrome. There definitely is research that says that women kind of get hit from both sides when it comes to expectations of what they should be able to do when it when we're speaking about maintaining their family and then maintaining their job, especially when women have kids, right? Because essentially no matter what they do, somebody's mad at them. If they
Right.
stay home and take care of their kids, then they're disappointing modern women, and they're not standing up for themselves, and and they're shamed because they're not in the workplace. But if they go into the workplace, well, then they're being terrible mothers. Their kids are being raised by strangers. There's really, we throw shame both directions. And so there kind of isn't a path really for women to go where there isn't somebody yelling at them about something. And I wonder, because we're looking at this persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud, I wonder if we've got some correlations there of, if somebody's always mad at you, you've always got this sense of guilt, then does that maybe lead to feeling more of this persistent internalized fear? Because now not only are you being a bad mom, but you're not even good at your job and you're being a bad mom. You know what I mean? Like the thing that you chose to do, that you're sacrificing your kids for, you are even more afraid of being found to be a fraud at that thing.
Right. And when you describe it like that, it sounds very serious. And I think that I'm glad you're making this point because, I threw around these air quotes talking about imposter syndrome at the beginning of the discussion today. And sure, we use this term that we sort of use in a silly way to kind of laugh off something that can be painful. But I think it's important that we remember that this can be really excruciatingly painful for people. And what you're describing, like the constant, I forget the words you use, but I was kind of thinking about people who are in like long-term abusive relationships, and how people who have these they're constantly being told they're not doing enough, or that they're kind of constantly in that threat mode. And I think this would apply to, of course, people not just in that situation, but if you're just feeling like you're constantly in that threat mode in general, I'm sure that that is related to feeling, this greater imposter syndrome, or perhaps being more at risk for some of the negative consequences, like, rumination and anxiety and all kinds of things that end up feeling very dysfunctional and kind of leading us down a rabbit hole of ill health because of that.
Let's explore that a little bit more. I want to get into what are the consequences of imposter syndrome, because we've talked about it in terms that were kind of funny, like me with my first apartment. We've talked about it in terms that were more serious, like the dual roles of women, and in us feeling in our professional jobs, feeling like imposters. So talk to me about consequences. What are the bad things that can potentially happen when we are experiencing persistent imposter syndrome?
I think it kind of holds you back. You're less likely to speak up at a meeting or put forth an idea that could be really valuable because you're scared that people are just going to shut you down.
In that way, it could actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy, couldn't it? Because if
Yeah, I
you
was just
are
thinking that.
not letting yourself give those ideas, you're not letting yourself participate, then you maybe aren't enjoying the success you would enjoy otherwise. And so you're actually, yeah, like you said, holding yourself back because you're afraid of that you're not worthy of success. So then you end up
It's
not
like that
succeeding.
backpedaling instead of, even though you're trying, you're like internally trying to reach toward this high achievement, really what you're doing is you're kind of self-sabotaging, which is going backwards.
Yeah. The thing that stuck out to me is I'm thinking about what you said, Angie, when you were defining it, and I'm reading these words that I've got in front of me, that it's a psychological pattern and it's persistent internalized fear. And the salient feeling that jumped out at me is this feeling of being tired. I mean, I just feel like it has to drain all of your
So
resources to just live in this fear. And when we're tired, we can't do as much. It takes up so much of our energy.
absolutely. And I was going to actually mention a piece that maps on well to that. So I studied the mind-body connection, and a lot of times when I'm thinking about, I use the term threat, and we're talking about these different types of things that in social and health psychology we would call social threats. So it's when we feel like we're going to be socially injured. It's kind of the way we talk about it, but it's basically like when our social standing or our connections with others that we have in some form are threatened. And so this feeling that we're not good enough, it puts us at a threat to kind of lose our place in the group, to not be accepted by others. And that's really bad for us. But our bodies physiologically feel that, and it definitely influences us under the skin. In fact, there's some research that shows that social threats are more damaging on, for, say, like a cortisol response. So social threats more likely to, prompt the release of stress hormones such as cortisol compared to a threat that's less socially threatening.
Yes. I teach about that in my health psych class. We talk a lot about that, about how the social threats, and I feel like there's another term I use other than social threat, but that kind of thing, that stress,
Yeah,
because it's something that,
chronic threat.
yes, chronic. That's the word I'm
Mhm.
looking for.
Yep.
This feeling
And
of,
it creates this like chronic stress response. We call it prolonged HPA axis activity. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so that has to do with all of that kind of those stress hormones and what's happening when we're kind of feeling fight or flight. And we can be feeling that fight or flight internally, like just because of our thoughts. And so what can happen over time is, so in the short term, cortisol, a stress hormone, actually acts to help us. But when it's chronic, when we're having these thoughts all of the time, that basically puts our system on overdrive and literally exhausts our adrenals. And so you no longer are feeling better because of your cortisol. You're feeling worse. You're feeling drained. You're feeling fatigued. You're feeling worn out. And I think that's what you're kind of thinking of, Michelle, is that
yes,
adrenal tap out situation.
yes,
And that's bad. Like
right.
this impacts us under the skin too.
Right. And it actually can delay our healing. Like we actually get sick more. Our immunological response goes down. We are unhealthy, or less healthy, I guess, when we're going through this chronic thing. And because it's basically this phenomenon that has no answer. There's no, I mean, like when you're dealing with a physical threat, at some point that's going to stop most of the time, like,
Right. Or you can pinpoint exactly where it is and make a change,
right.
or touch a hot stove or move your hand.
Right, exactly. But here we're dealing with something where there's no answer. And so it just keeps going on. And so you end up in this state of fatigue.
I wonder if syndrome also has to do with not asking for raises and promotions.
Oh
Absolutely.
my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's scary.
You don't feel like you're
Sad.
worthy of it, so you're actually kind of self-sabotaging your career a little.
We're going back to that self-sabotage thing and that self-fulfilling prophecy that you're keeping yourself down because of your own sense of doubt. Oh, and then what about relationships? Because I was just thinking about when we were just talking about our imposter experiences a few minutes ago, and I'm talking about these people who are coming to visit me and telling me my apartment's so nice. And Angie's talking about the people at the barn, and like there's these, and Chelsea was talking about the people who were talking to her, and she feels like an imposter. And we perceive the things they're saying to us to be highlighting this imposter syndrome. Do you think that it's possible, the fact that we are filtering what they're saying to us through this sense of imposter syndrome, that it could hamper our ability to form these relationships because we're feeling so defensive?
Definitely. So it takes me a minute when someone asks if I'm a graduate student for me to be able to smile and say, nope, second year faculty, actually, right? Or kind of turn it into some kind of joke. And I try to laugh it off. And then they're like, oh man, it's such a compliment to think that you look younger than you are. And I've just heard it so many times that I have the easy answer, but I'm always just kind of disappointed.
Yeah.
And so I think it can be much harder to form those relationships if you go into it with that kind of disappointment or feeling as though they might not take you seriously or could be biased against you from the outset.
Right.
Yes. Echoing Chelsea, like that was my experience when I met you guys. I thought that you all liked me as a friend, but you didn't take me seriously as like a scientist, or I had nothing to offer other than like being a good friend.
Oh my gosh, Jen.
Aw.
And seriously, you are so brilliant. Like that could not be further from the truth.
So yeah, I've published, data with you. We've written things, and I kind of did that because you were awesome, not because I didn't think, and you were an awesome scientist, not because I was just your friend, to be clear.
So there's this other thing called meta imposter syndrome, where when you're with a group of people and they're all experiencing imposter syndrome, and you're the person in the group thinking that they are fake imposters, but you're the real imposter.
Michelle, did you just make that up?
No, I sent a meme to her like
Just kidding.
months ago.
Yeah. And I was like,
I
what?
actually am the real imposter.
No, I'm the real imposter.
We're analyzing multiple layers here, ladies. Multiple layers.
We can
To
all
be
be
clear-
imposters.
To be clear, meta imposter syndrome is not a thing. That was a joke I made. That is not an actual phenomenon.
In all seriousness, just one more note on the relationship piece. I was actually thinking when Michelle first said that more about my close relationships. So, like our relationships with our most intimate partners, like our romantic partners. And I was just thinking about, okay, how, first of all, I have to even think about how to define success in my marriage, which is horrible. Like, that sounds awful, but it's not what it sounds like. What I'm thinking of is like, I like to keep my house looking a certain way. I like my decor to be a certain way. I like to keep fresh flowers, or I like to be a homemaker, even though I am a career woman as well. And I really value that. And sometimes my husband will be lovely and compliment something like, oh, I just love what you, well, also, by the way, for those of you who don't have heterosexual male partners that feel this way, but he does actually like notice these things because he's like very stylish and into this, sometimes to my dismay, but in this case it's a pro. But he'll compliment me or say like, oh, I'm so glad you did that, or look how nice, oh, did you put up new curtains, those are so beautiful. And I'll be like, I don't know about them. Yeah, I don't really think, are you sure? Like, you sure you like them? And I'm not saying, are you sure you like them because of the curtains? I'm asking, are you sure I deserve to be thanked for the curtains that Target created and I just went and bought? Like, almost as if my time, my thought, and my like process of doing that isn't valid. And that's my success. Like, I should be reveling in it. Like, yes, Target supported me, but I did that. They wouldn't be there without me, and I was making our home a home. And so I do think, like, what am I missing in my relationship by not accepting those compliments or those positive things that are happening in my relationship because I'm feeling like an imposter and like, oh, surely he's just pointing this out because I'm not doing a good enough job.
Right.
And that's what's going in my head. Does
Right.
that, you know what I mean?
Maybe he's trying to like help guide you rather than
help
giving you an honest compliment.
Yeah,
that
or
kind
help
of thing.
ease the fact that I didn't do the dishes, or help, maybe he's just trying to appease me.
Right.
All these kind of like stories that go on in the background where I could just be more connected with him in that moment and say, thank you so much. Yeah, I did that for us. And like, let's be together now in this moment.
Right. All right. I think this is a good place to take another break. And then when we come back, what I'd like to talk about are some strategies of how we can deal with imposter syndrome. Now that we've identified it and we see it in our lives and we see some of the negative outcomes that can come from it, let's talk about how we deal with that. So we're going to take just a couple minute break and we'll be right back. Okay, so welcome back. We are going to finish up with some strategies of how we can deal with imposter syndrome in our daily lives. What can we do to address this so that we can escape some of those negative outcomes? Anyone have any ideas?
I think for me, imposter syndrome kind of like waxes and wanes. So when I'm having like a really strong bout of feeling imposter syndrome, the first thing I can do to help myself feel better is to reach out and talk about it. So I'll text you lovely ladies, or I'll reach out to somebody at work who can just hear me out, and then that kind of helps me through it. So seeking that social support and being vulnerable, saying like, hey, this is what I'm feeling at this moment.
I would say that's one of my strategies, my first strategies as well, is social support. So in case you didn't pick up from context clues, listeners, the four of us went to grad school. We were in different years, but we all overlapped a little bit. And so we became close friends in grad school. So we've been able to support each other since grad school as we've gone through our careers. So I definitely think social support is one of my first go-tos for strategies for imposter syndrome.
So I was researched and preparing for today's discussion here. I was like, oh, how, again, I was having imposter syndrome about being the expert on this kind of topic. I was like, how would I tell people to solve this? And so I Googled it. Yes, PhD in psychology, Googled it. But I liked some of the things that I saw. So one quote that I liked was, the only way to stop feeling like an imposter is to stop thinking like an imposter. And again, then it goes like, okay, well, then how do we do that? Right. But I think one important piece that I took away from it, I liked the idea of write your rules. So like, first of all, you have to be able to recognize when one of these thoughts are happening, when you are feeling like an imposter. But for those situations where we don't really know what the expectations are, well, let's set some actual realistic expectations for ourselves. And perhaps in some situations, there's unrealistic expectations on you that are external as well. What would happen if we could rewrite those rules? And so, for example, for some and there might be in their head like, oh, I can never ask for help. And because I never ask for help, I feel like the weight of the world is on me and I have to figure this all out by myself. But then that perpetuates this feeling that I'm not doing enough or that I shouldn't be in this position. And no, if we give ourselves a new rule, if you like rules, to no, I can reach out, I can ask for help. So kind of finding whether we can bring ease and flexibility into areas that we're being inflexible, even if it's just in our thoughts or rules we create for ourselves, that could be very helpful.
I like that. I think another strength of that plan is that I feel like sometimes the expectations that we have for ourselves are very fuzzy. We don't actually know exactly what they are. We just kind of instinctively feel like we're not meeting them. So to force ourselves to actually write them down, to say, this is the expectation that I have. Once it's in words, then we are forced to look at it and decide, is this realistic or unrealistic? Because once we write down, I can't ask for help, obviously we're going to realize that is not realistic or not even a good rule to put for ourselves. So just making ourselves define will help us to see that we actually aren't defying or going against any expectations that are reasonable.
I think my imposter syndrome tends to kick in when I feel like I'm not making the mark or I've failed in my own mind in some way. And so if I feel like I've failed at one thing, I like to engage in self-affirmation. Self-affirmation is where if I'm feeling like an imposter at my job, I can bolster my self-esteem. I can make myself feel better by reflecting on how well I'm doing in another aspect of who I am. So I may not be doing the best moving all of my classes to remote learning. But man, I'm doing so great with my relationship and my dogs and trying to eat healthy, right? So I can focus on all of these other behaviors that I'm really making strides in to make up for the fact that I'm not doing well in all areas all the time.
Yes, I think that I like that. I like that as a strategy. I also think, however, that you are doing perfectly well in putting your stuff online. This is a huge ask that we're going through for context. In case you're not listening to this in the same time period as when we're recording it, we're going through the coronavirus pandemic right now. So us professors are having to move our classes entirely to remote learning, and it's difficult. We're struggling with this a little bit. So that's what she's talking about, and she's doing a fine job. Don't you believe her? But I think along those lines, I have a book and like a literal actual notebook that I call my brag book, that when I get like an email from a student that is particularly complimentary, or really from anybody, or someone texts me something nice or whatever, I print it out and cut it out and paste it in that book, so that when I'm feeling like I'm just really bad at life, I can go and flip through that book and realize that some other people don't think I'm that bad at life, and that can help me feel better.
I think Jen told me about this. Jen, are you the one that does the gratitude folder, the thank you or the great email folder?
Yeah, whenever I get a cool email or somebody just says something super nice, I'll just slip that right into that folder so I can do the same thing.
Love that.
Yeah.
It also goes in my tenure packet, which
Yeah.
is a list of expectations for my behavior.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's a whole nother animal.
I just want to give one more piece of advice, just in case. So a lot of I think we gave, hopefully you agree that we gave some good advice at the end of this, at least we were trying, but we kind of, through all of those pieces of advice, it kind of assumes that you can dig yourself out of the imposter syndrome hole some way. And the thing that I have really survived through imposter syndrome with, like, and I'm talking about like when you have no like cognitive or emotional resources left, like you are just totally tapped out and you just don't think you can go on, and when you're about to backpedal to this sake, like to the extent that you're going to like actually quit something that you're going to regret, the biggest advice I can give is fake it till you make it. And my dear friend, she taught me this when I worked with her in the event planning business. And we often, especially at the beginning of her business venture, when I was working with her from she was building her business from the ground up, and we would often have these imposter syndrome moments where it was like, is someone going to realize we don't know what we're doing now? Believe me, that was like 10 years ago. She definitely knows what she's doing now. But the thing that she told me was, hey, fake it until you make it. And most of the time that actually works. And I've done that, when I was struggling through graduate school. I've done that with my horse. I was figured, okay, if I just act the way I think I'm supposed to act or look the way I think I'm supposed to look, my horse will respond, or whatever it is, whatever example it is. And so I just want to make sure everybody knows that you can always fake it till you make it if all else fails.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. The fake it till you make it. I think what I would like people to also realize, we know this from our research, is that faking it can convince you as well. Like if
Right.
you put on a smile, you put on a confident feeling, if you act confident, you will believe you are confident. That our body speaks to our mind such that it goes both ways. Our mind can tell our body how to act, but then our body, if we make it take certain postures or certain stances, then that will convince our mind we feel that way as well. So the fake it till you make it actually really does help.
It's convincing us before it's convincing anyone else. And that's kind of the important part to be able to go on, right? So that makes sense. It's a good point, Michelle.
Yeah. I do want to say, though, I just kind of feel the need to put this out there. If you are struggling with a persistent internalized fear or anxiety of any kind that you just can't shake, and it's causing you to have negative outcomes, don't feel embarrassed about seeking counseling. I mean, counseling can absolutely help you with that. And we're talking about this imposter syndrome, and everyone's going to experience it on different levels. Sometimes it's going to be fairly shallow, like me in my apartment. Sometimes it's going to be more deep. But if you really feel like this syndrome or any other kind of fear or anxiety is causing you to not be able to live your best life, please talk to counselors about it, because they absolutely can help you with that. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, ladies. And also thank you, listeners, for joining us today. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, or you just want to check out our supporting materials or share your experience with imposter syndrome, you can find us at our website, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So definitely check in there. We would love to chat with you. Just so everyone knows, all of the views we express on this podcast today are ours alone, and we are not representative of our respective organizations. So if you don't like something we said, we have to take the heat all by ourselves. In addition to that, we are researchers, not counselors. So please don't take our advice in any kind of diagnostic capacity. Special thanks to our editor and producer, Travis Woodley, and to everyone who recommends us or leaves us a rating on your podcast app. If you really enjoyed the content and want access to more, visit our page on Patreon and become one of our supporters to help cover our production costs. See you next time on Inside the Chrysalis.